The S tier wide receiver rankings rest of season has been the same pretty much for the past 6 weeks. It's JSN, Puka Nacua, and Ja'Marr Chase. You rank them in whatever order you want. Now that JSN has finally started scoring more points per game than Puka Nacua, I'll put JSN at the 1 spot. I know Chase was bad this past week, but keep in mind, there's a real shot you get Joe Burrow back in like 2 to 3 weeks. And if that does happen, Ja'Marr could easily outscore Puka Nacua and JSN. So you can pick whichever one of these wide receivers that you want. They're already all through their bye week, so you're going to get the same amount of games played from all of them as well. Now, moving over to CeeDee Lamb. We have not seen CeeDee Lamb play just yet. I am actually going to be fading CeeDee Lamb points against the Raiders tonight. I think I am up by about 44 points right now, and I'm fading Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb. Pray for me in the comments. But Lamb has only hit 20 fantasy points twice this season. Now, of course, we know the ceiling is crazy high. You can go back to 2023, the last time you had Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb both fully healthy for an entire year, and CeeDee Lamb averaged almost 24 points per game. So any week that you have Lamb and Dak healthy together, Lamb's projection is going to be through the roof. Like right now on Underdog Fantasy, higher lower 86.5 receiving yards for tonight. Our next wide receiver is going to be Amon-Ra St. Super disappointing this past week against the Eagles, where he only scores 6.2 fantasy points. This is actually the, I want to say, third worst game that he has had in the past 2 seasons. But with this in mind, he had 12 targets. It was just a horrendous night for Jared Goff. Sportsbooks had the projections for this Detroit Lions offense incredibly low going into this game. They knew what's up. And if we look into the future, I mean, it's not like the matchups are going to be this tough for Amon-Ra St. Brown every single week. And then Rashee Rice will be our next wide receiver. Same thing with Rice that you had with St. Brown. I mean, he was disappointing in fantasy today, only dropping 9.8 fantasy points, but he still had 9 targets. He still had all the volume. So I'm not concerned about either one of these receivers whatsoever. I'm not really concerned about Egbuka whatsoever either. I know he only scores 9 fantasy points. I know Sean Tucker has legitimately everything in this offense. But with that in mind, Egbuka had 9 targets. It doesn't seem like you're ever going to get Evans back for this season. Even with Godwin being back at practice, Godwin can come back in and there will still be more than enough target volume for Egbuka. Justin Jefferson will be our next wide receiver. Jefferson, I know, just looks like he's stuck with some of the worst quarterback play in the league. But at one point, you also had Ja'Marr Chase down bad like that. We continue to rank Chase as that low-end wide receiver 1. Now, yes, he got saved, I guess, with Joe Flacco coming over. But I would just always have such a hard time telling you like, oh yeah, you drafted Justin Jefferson, an elite wide receiver in his prime in the first round of fantasy drafts, and now you need to value him as a wide receiver 2 rest of season because McCarthy's bad. Like, definitely is not an S tier wide receiver, clearly, but I'd still have him as a top 10 name. Nico Collins is the wide receiver 1 for my own fantasy team, and I'm super excited about the production that we've had over the past few weeks. If you actually look at the past 4 games that Nico Collins has played, he's had 10, 11, 15, and 10 targets. And if you go ahead and actually look at what you had in that week 7 game against the Seattle Seahawks, he left early with a concussion. So if you remove that game, the last 4 fully healthy games that he's played, he scored 16, 14.5, 22.5, and 24 fantasy points. He's been just fine with Davis Mills. Now, it does seem like you're probably going to get Davis Mills in week 12 as well, where this concussion for Stroud's pretty serious. Davante Adams will be our next wide receiver. With Davante Adams, he literally had 1 receiving yard this past week, but he still found the end zone. Davante Adams this season has 10 receiving touchdowns, and we're in week 12. The man's been a monster in the red zone. Clearly Puka Nacua is the alpha, but you also have a tight end injury here, which is just going to condense the target tree even more between these 2 wide receivers. And then looking at George Pickens, Pickens has definitely regressed ever since you had CeeDee Lamb come back into this offense over the past 3 weeks. He hasn't cracked 15 fantasy points, but he's still seeing a decent amount of volume over the past 3 weeks. He's averaging, 7, 8 targets a game. And if you go through and look at the projections that you have for George Pickens tonight against the Raiders, he's currently higher or lower 64.5 receiving yards on Underdog. And again, I'm hoping we get a Pickens day, not a Lamb day, because I want to move to 9-2. I want to win my matchup. But obviously, if you want to check out any of those projections over on Underdog, the link's always in the description. It's always in the comment section. Code FLOCK will get you $100 added to your account after you play your first 5. And on top of that, you're going to get a Gimme CD Lamb Pick, higher, lower, half a total yard for tonight's game. And you'll get free questions that you can ask me in the live streams. And we're live streaming every single day until Christmas, answering your questions. Now, C tier is when things begin to widen out. We are going to have Chris Olave here. I mean, with Olave, dropped 21.5 points the last game that we saw him in. But the main reason why I want to rank him this highly is he's averaging 9.5 targets per game. You have no Shaheed. He's literally the entire offense for the New Orleans Saints. Now, this is a garbage offense, don't get me wrong, which is why there are so many players in this tier that I think you could consider ranking over Olave. Like Michael Pittman Jr. isn't anywhere close to the same target volume. Pittman's actually averaging only 7 targets per game, which again is 2.5 fewer than what you have with Olave, but the efficiency, especially from a touchdown perspective, has just been much better. But that's kind of the expectation, right? If you're in a much better offense. Then T. Higgins will be our next wide receiver. T. Higgins comes through with the receiving touchdown this past week. T. Higgins so far this season is currently sitting here with 13.5 fantasy points per game. He's only averaging 6.5 targets per game. If you told me that you did not have Burrow coming back this year, I would actually rank T. Higgins at the bottom of this tier, potentially the tier below. But I'm making this ranking under the assumption that Joe Burrow is back in week 14, which is what's currently being reported. Now, Rome Odunze will be our next wide receiver. With Rome, dropped 6 fantasy points this past week. And now this is the continued trend of the inconsistency, right? Where we go through and we look at since the bye, Rome has had 2 games with 15 or more fantasy points. And he's had 4 games with 6 or fewer. So, I mean, he looked incredible at the beginning of the season. Clearly, he has fallen off in a dramatic way. Then our next name is going to be Jaylen Waddle. With Waddle, I have him as my wide receiver 2 on my own fantasy team. I was really hoping that we had a big game against Washington, and it wasn't that at all. Like, he only scored 8.2 fantasy points. And now we're actually going to have to deal with Waddle having the week 12 bye. So I'm not going to have him this week. Going to get him back in week 13. The only saving grace is, well, the Dolphins are garbage. A lot of these games into the future are winnable, and they're going to be in them. Like the New Orleans Saints, week 13, the Dolphins will probably be favored. Against the Jets in week 14, the Dolphins will probably be favored. You're not super worried about the Pittsburgh matchup, not worried about the Cincy matchup either. We just saw Josh Allen drop 6 touchdowns against Tampa, so I like the schedule for Waddle. Tedero McMillan comes through with a massive blow up, 33 fantasy points, is now averaging 13.9 fantasy points per game so far this season. Obviously, the volume's been incredible. My only holdup is I think that more times than not, Bryce Young is not going to have 400 passing yards more times than not. Bryce Young is going to have this as a below average offense when it comes to passing volume. Now, Devonta Smith will be our next wide receiver. Smith averaging 13.3 fantasy points per game. Not a good showing against the Detroit Lions, to say the least, scoring 1.8 fantasy points and doing literally nothing for my best ball teams. And moving over to the last wide receiver in this tier with Drake London, it's impossible for me to rank him. I'm recording this video extremely late on Sunday night / Monday morning, to be honest. If we were looking at what we have with the Michael Penix and Drake London injuries, neither are being reported right now to be serious long-term out for the season. But hell, if London misses 3 to 4 weeks, you're not getting him back until the fantasy playoffs. And if you're 5-6, you need to sell that name right this second. Now, moving over to D tier, we are going to be led off with Debo Samuel. Now, Debo Samuel, y'all saw this past week, was higher than this in our rankings. And in our weekly rankings in week 12, will probably be higher than this as well. But rest of season, the reason we're going to have him a little bit lower is, 1, you have to deal with the week 12 bye, so you're not going to have him this week. And 2, on top of this, you're also going to get Terry McLaurin back eventually. Now, we don't exactly know when that will be, but there's a real shot you get Terry back after the bye. Now, Olave and McConkey will be our next wide receiver. I would say this is the biggest faller that we are going to have out of the Los Angeles Chargers debacle against the Jacksonville Jaguars, just because Olave and McConkey had been ranked as the premium wide receiver here, as somebody that was just a must-start name. Where now I think all these wide receivers in D tier and below, if you were to bench them in a tough matchup, I'm not going to fault you whatsoever. Like, I keep on thinking that Zay Flowers is going to finally turn the corner now that Lamar Jackson's back in. And while Flowers has given you a relatively decent floor where he's had double-digit fantasy points every single week, he hasn't scored a touchdown since week 1. So even if he is getting you double-digit fantasy points every week, it frankly doesn't matter much. If the touchdown's not there, the ceiling is going to be severely capped. Then our next name is going to be Stefon Diggs. Diggs trending 100% in the right direction, but I don't know how much of that is Stefon Diggs related or how much of that is Kayshon Boutte's injury expanding the role for Stefon Diggs. This next week, he's going to be in a great spot against Cincinnati, but you also have the week 14 bye. And again, you're not going to have Boutte out rest of the year. Jameson Williams is a wide receiver that, I mean, I just have to go through and move up our rankings in a dramatic way. Y'all know I've never been a big JMO guy. My take is always it's going to be a super volatile wide receiver, give you some big weeks, give you a lot of dud weeks. And he's had 3 straight good performances now with the receiving touchdown in each one. And Jameson Williams just naturally has to get the bump up with the change in play calling. Obviously, they're looking his way more often. Also, the more important thing is Sam Laporta's injury is just going to mean that Jameson Williams has to take some of those targets. It's not like Brock Wright's going to have all of them. So you've had at least 6 targets since the bye in every game for Jameson Williams, and he's averaging almost 12 fantasy points per game. It's funny, like, we can sit here and say, like, oh, Jameson is averaging almost 12 fantasy points per game. He's still like a low-end wide receiver, 3 in points per game. DK Metcalf is on my own fantasy team. I was really excited about this matchup against Cincy, and he doesn't even crack 10 fantasy points. Like, 3 straight weeks under 10 points. In the games in which he hasn't scored a touchdown, he has scored 12.3, 8, 2.6, 6.5, 9.9 fantasy points. He's a touchdown or bust wide receiver in a bad offense. Brian Thomas, honestly, I think you could convince me that this Brian Thomas ranking is garbage in either direction. You could convince me that I have him way too low, or you could convince me that I have him way too high. How I look at this as of right now is Brian Thomas is an injured wide receiver that is averaging 10.7 fantasy points per game this season. That's fewer than Marvin Harrison. Like, Marvin Harrison's going to be our next name. I'm making this ranking under the assumption that Marv's at the very most only missing 1 more week. From what I've seen people putting out there, is I've seen a lot of people who seem like they're in the know say, oh, Marv's only going to miss 1 week with appendicitis, blah, blah, blah. Side note, I actually shadowed a surgeon back in the day when I thought I was going to medical school and saw a surgery where they remove it. Oh my gosh, insane. But I don't know. I mentioned in the video last night that Marv is going to be back next week, and everybody in the comment section lost their mind on me. So we'll see. Our next tier is going to be led off with A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown, incredible week this past week, right? One of the best weeks that he has had all season. It was his 4th best game this year, and he scored 11.9 fantasy points. The dude's been horrible. And I know, again, everybody wants to just blame Jalen Hurts, but for me, I go ahead and I look at this. Every single time A.J. Brown gets the ball thrown towards him, a defender's literally all over him. He has 0 inches of separation, legitimately 0. Jordan Addison will be our next name. With Addison, he's playing with a really bad quarterback, and Justin Jefferson's clearly the alpha. Like, he got lucky to get the touchdown this past week. Troy Franklin will be our next name. Troy Franklin, now technically averaging fewer points per game right now than Courtland Sutton, but if you look at the target volume that Franklin's had, I mean, over the past 5 weeks, it's been great. Over the past 5 weeks, he's had at least 8 targets in every single game. And moving over to Wan'Dale Robinson. With Wan'Dale, I don't know if we're going to get Darius Slayton back this week. I don't know if we're going to get Jackson Dart back this week. Wan'Dale Robinson obviously hasn't been incredible, but the target volume is there where he's averaging 8 targets a game. And then Courtland Sutton trending in the wrong direction. With Sutton, we have not seen him crack more than 10.5 fantasy points in 4 weeks now. He hasn't hit 20 fantasy points since week 3. And you have to deal with the week 12 Broncos bye. Now, Ricky Pearsall comes back this week against the Arizona Cardinals, and he has a total of 1 fantasy point. So, not great. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt because he hasn't been in practice. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt because this wasn't a real football game. The Niners just absolutely boat raced the Cardinals, but still. Now, Quentin Johnston will be the last wide receiver in this tier. With the big Q, again, he's just not startable, really, it seems. When you have Gadsden in this offense, Gadsden just siphons away too much from the receivers. Now, going over to the F tier, we are going to be led off with Romeo Doubs. Doubs could have had a strong day if it wasn't for the drops, but could have, would have, should have. Fact of the matter is, he's averaging 11.5 fantasy points per game, does not look startable. Like, Alec Pierce may be a better option at this point, where Alec Pierce, I guess, how can I say that? Alec Pierce hasn't scored 20 points at all this season. Like, really, wide receiver, I feel like you get a big teardrop. Like, D tier and above, I'm excited about, but anybody below that, it's like, what are these guys? Keenan Allen, how could you ever put Keenan inside your starting lineup? Last time you had 10 fantasy points was week 7. Juwan Jennings, no idea how you could go through and put him in your starting lineup. Ricky Pearsall's back and Kittle's the monster. Jacoby Myers, don't know how you could put him in your starting lineup. I mean, ultimately, you're about to get Brian Thomas back in. Terry McLaurin, it's very difficult to rank until we actually see him. Like, Terry McLaurin's yet to score 15 fantasy points this season. Chris Godwin was back at practice this past week, but Godwin's best game of his year, he scored 5.5 fantasy points. Xavier Worthy, I drafted in a bunch of Underdog best ball drafts just like Godwin. Please, for the love of God, guys, do something. But Xavier Worthy has scored more than 10 points once. Michael Wilson, I know, dropped 33.5 points this past week, was the wide receiver 1 in fantasy. But ultimately, can I sit here and tell you that we are excited about his long-term value? No. I mean, Michael Wilson, before this game, you look back at all 2024 and all of this year as well, he hadn't scored 15 points in a single game. So it's just like a 1 week fill-in in garbage time with no Marvin Harrison. Christian Watson drops 20 points this week, but he had 5 targets. Trey Tucker, we'll see what he does against Dallas, but last time he scored double-digit points was week 6. Garrett Wilson, we may not see at any point through the rest of the year. They're telling us that his season's not over, but I don't see why they would rush him back if it's week 16. Khalil Shakir, in a game in which Josh Allen just scored 6 touchdowns, just scored half a fantasy point. DJ Moore, over the past 2 games, has scored 3 fantasy points. DJ Moore has had more than 6 targets in a game once this season, and that was a game with 7 targets. Brandon Ayuk, God knows if we'll ever see him play football again. And then Shaheed joined the Seahawks, and we haven't seen him have more than 5 fantasy points so far. So please let me know what y'all are doing with the wide receivers F tier and below. In my mind, it's like, if you don't have a wide receiver E tier above that you're considering starting, like, RIP. But I think that's all I got for you. I really appreciate you and hope I was able to help you out in some way with this. Of course, if you want to check out any of those Underdog projections, links in the description. It's in the comment section. Code FLOCK will give you $100 added to your account after you play your first 5. And on top of that, you'll be able to get a Gimme CD Lamb pick, higher, lower, half a total yard. And you'll get free questions for the live streams that you can ask me. And I'm going to be live streaming every single day until Christmas, answering your fantasy questions. But I really appreciate you and really hope I get to see you out in the live stream later tonight.